Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. It's good to be back after a brief hiatus. Well, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has invited his Indian counterpart, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, for the G7 summit as he confirmed details on Sunday for the high-level meeting to be presided over by Britain in the coastal region of Cornwall between June 11th and 13th. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze G7 and India. Joining me on the program today are Jitendranath Mishra, former ambassador, Pramit Pal Chaudhary, foreign editor of the Hindustan Times, and Sreeram Chaulia, foreign affairs expert. Thank you to my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Sreeram Chaulia, let's talk about G7 itself. Significance of the G7. What is it that it brings to the table? What can India's role be? What does all of this mean for India?
Yeah, Frank, G7 was a group of rich, industrialized capitalist countries to begin with in the 1970s. And it was actually meant to be a coordination forum to counter communism and communist ideas in those days. Now, lately, what has happened is, as Ambassador was saying, their economic growth has slowed, while emerging powers, including BRICS countries, especially China, but others, have also risen parallel to this relative decline of the rich countries. So G7, ultimately, in a way, there was an expansion of sorts. Although G7 remained as a separate grouping of these rich countries, we got the G20, right? That's now, in its second decade in existence now. So we have been saying in India for a long time that the G7 was not representative enough of the changed global economic and military and power realities. So to that extent, the G7 has indeed declined in importance. But I think given this special characteristic of being a club of democracies, and also the fact that the US is still there in it, and even though Trump was never an enthusiastic participant in it, with the change in administration in Washington and Biden coming in, I think they will look to lift the relevance and the heft of G7, as well as other multilateral bodies, even G20. So I think when we talk of club of democracies or simply reinvigorating G7, for Britain, for obvious reasons, after Brexit, they need the so-called global Britain. They need to show leadership. So as the host countries of G7 have a prerogative to invite special countries other than the permanent members. So that's where, for example, France, Biarritz, invited Prime Minister Modi in 2019 as well. And the US was going to invite us in 2020 as well, had it happened. So to that extent, it shows that this grouping may still have some value, especially with regard to confrontation with China and the ideological differences. They're talking about technology. That's one key area where they need consensus. There are some European countries that are members of G7, but which have gone in favor of investment agreement with China recently. So Britain, after Brexit, is looking more towards the US and to align closer to the US agenda. And the Europeans are the big iffy group in the middle. You have Italy, France, Germany. I mean, they need to have clarity on this. Can we have alternative to Huawei for 5G, for example? Can we have alternative to the Chinese debt trap in the form of financing mechanisms, for example? Climate change, again, this is an area where the Europeans think of themselves as leaders, but can we all come together and form alternative to the Chinese coal-based economic growth model, which they are now exporting worldwide? So I think there is now of a basis for a rebirth of G7, and I think involving India, Australia, South Korea shows that Pacific dimension, the Indo-Pacific dimension also, because ultimately the Western countries, there was only Japan in it as a permanent member. There's no other Asian country in it. So to bring in more Asian countries from the Indo-Pacific is a good idea. It's a sign that the Indo-Pacific momentum will also build up as a result.
Sreeram Chaulia, so what does this mean for the bilateral relationship between India and the UK?
Yeah, Frank, there's been a lot of talk about how allegedly India's image has suffered in the Western world. I mean, there's been this whole narrative spread by anti-India elements both within our country and abroad saying that somehow, due to some issues relating to minorities and intolerance and all that, India's stature has fallen in the international public opinion and international arena. That is totally false. Why are we being invited repeatedly to these most important forums? Why did we get 184 out of 192 votes in the UN General Assembly to get elected, to get a non-permanent seat in the Security Council? So I think these are indicators that Britain definitely and the Western world as a whole still holds India in very high regard. We should not fall for some, ideologically biased media houses that are spreading this tendency that somehow, our image is being spoiled. Actually, our image is rising, and that is an important, this is an indicator of that. And for Britain, I think they are looking increasingly to the US. One, they want a bilateral trade deal with the US. And two, they will have to come to India. And they will need a lot of support in Asia for rebuilding, because they have lost free access to the European market. Although they did a deal at the end of 2020, it's not going to ensure, especially for their service sector, free access. So they're looking at big markets, and India automatically comes up on top for them due to the colonial legacy, the Commonwealth linkage, the English language, ease with which the investors can come in and go out. And even defense, I think they've got some assets in the Indian Ocean region, and we want to do what we are doing with France, also with Britain to a lesser extent. And ultimately, I think Britain is worried about the Chinese behemoth, because the excessive Chinese penetration into the European Union, heart of the EU itself,
Right.
the Brits were warning against it. And they were trying to, but then, the Germans, because of Volkswagen and all these things, they want access to the Chinese market. And the Germans carried the day on this investment agreement they recently did. Had Britain remained within the EU, I think it would not have been such a cakewalk for the Chinese to seal this new investment agreement with the European Union. So I think
Sure.
Britain values India much more now. And the ideological, it's coming into sharp relief now. Authoritarianism versus free countries. The more we emphasize that, it is better for us strategically, and the better it is for us to form a coalition to manage the hegemonic rise of China.
I've got about 2 minutes left on the program. Quick closing comments from all my panelists with the best way forward. All right, Sreeram Chaulia?
I think G7 plus 3, whatever we want to call it, D10 or G10, we should come up with some concrete proposals for cooperative projects in the Indo-Pacific. This is now becoming very, very crucial, especially connectivity and infrastructure projects. The US had announced last year that India could also join the Blue Dot network that they already have for certification of infrastructure projects. But more than certification, we need financing. Japan is a part of G7, and they can shell out the money to some extent. But if we pool resources, create a big fund, and launch an alternative, infrastructure building alliance
Right.
of sorts for development, I think it will go a long way in pushing back the creeping shadow of China all over the developing world. We need to do a lot together and come up with concrete proposals. Otherwise, talk is cheap, as they say in international relations, and the Chinese can walk away saying, no harm done.
Right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to my panelists for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us.